I always spend the last couple of months of the year reflecting on what's happened during the year. This allows me to plan better for the upcoming year. Sometimes that means building upon what has worked. Other times, that means adjusting strategies and approaches that didn't quite work. Here are my 5 key takeaways as a podcast editor in 2024. When I started editing podcasts, I took a course that taught me a lot. It taught me everything you can think of that applies to recording, engineering, and editing high quality podcasts. Coming from a music production background, really kind of as a hobbyist, not as a professional, I approached the master bus like I did with music, by adding plugins to add little bits of flavor or an enhancement to the overall sound. The course I took didn't dissuade us from that approach, but I really wish that it did. Takeaway number one: less is more. Over the 5 years I've been doing this, I've found myself slowly reducing the number of plugins that I use. Part of that's because I use Hindenburg and they limit the number of plugins I can use for each track. But the master bus was the one that I struggled with the most. At one point, I had an excessive chain that included 2 compressors. One of them wasn't even compressing, but I had it there because it seemed to add something a little extra to the audio. I had a tape emulation, a vitalizer, a limiter, and of course a loudness meter. In my head, or to my ears, it made things sound better. And it's really an easy trap to fall into with plugins. I remember last year I made a video talking about how I liked the Silver Bullet Mark II plugin for its EQ and its ability to add a little of that analog flavor to tracks. I still think it does add that, but I have stripped it away from my editing work because it wasn't absolutely necessary. I started removing these plugins one by one. First, it was the vitalizer. Then I took off the tape emulation. This year, I'm down to 1 compressor, a limiter, and the loudness meter. I only turn on the compressor if the episode is still a little too dynamic and I need to shave off a little more of those dynamics. But for the most part, I try to nail that during the mix so I don't need the additional compression on the master. And the benefit for me is that the episodes still sound good, but they have less processing overall. And because there's less processing, it takes less time to render. I really think I started seeing this shift in my approach when the new generation of noise and reverb reduction plugins came out, and I started to move away from using RX or the RX editor. The other thing that really helped me was producing my own content. It helped me realize that I really need to focus on the essentials and what is needed rather than trying to make everything sound as good as possible. Yeah, I can probably make my mixes sound, 3% or 5% better. It's really just an arbitrary number because we can't really measure audio quality. Over the last couple of years, though, I've stopped doing personal A/B tests. I feel they just don't really help matters because we start to obsess over small, minute details that the vast majority of people don't care about, they don't appreciate, and really, most people can't even hear the things we're obsessing over. Instead of doing my own A/B tests, I simply make a change when I'm mixing an episode, and if it's not working, I'll switch it out. If it sounds fine, I'll leave it in and make decisions based on client feedback. And to this point, I haven't received any feedback, positive or negative, from clients when I've made these changes. And this brings us to number two. I don't need to use the RX. This is a change I made in, I guess, the summer of 2023 when I started testing Supertone Clear and heard how well it performed for noise and reverb reduction. And if that's not up to the task, I now turn to DX Revive Pro, which it's quickly surpassed its competition to my ears by adding new algorithms since it's been released. RX, it's been such a critical part of the cleanup process for me that I couldn't see a future where I didn't start each editing session in the RX editor for cleanup. I still feel that RX has a few tricks up its sleeves that the others can't touch, but I don't need that level of power for the type of work I'm doing. The only RX module I use these days is Mouth Declick because I haven't found anything that handles mouth noise as well as that. I use Mouth Declick as a plugin since that's the most efficient workflow for me. There's no need to go into the RX editor just to run it. And I've now been working without the RX editor for about 18 months, and I have yet to run into a recording that I felt I had to go into the editor to clean up better. This process has allowed me to really standardize my cleanup process so that I spend the same amount of time cleaning up each piece of audio. This has kind of the added benefit of rewarding those who prioritize capturing good recordings, and it penalizes those who just don't care. If a client turns in a poor sounding recording, they have the option of paying more for me to do more additional work in RX. But you know what? So far, no one has felt it was worth paying for that additional work over just throwing it in and applying a plugin to it. Another thing I've found from doing these client tests and kind of standardizing my cleanup process is that the clients don't hear what we hear. I would A/B test plugins to see which sounded better, but then, like I mentioned earlier, I'd get no feedback from the client saying, hey, you know what? This episode sounded amazing. What did you do? I changed from manually dialing in my EQ and compression for each piece of audio to using Sonible's Smart EQ and Smart Comp. And if you're not familiar with those, you basically train it on a piece of audio and it uses machine learning to basically recommend settings for your EQ or your compression. At first, I would still tweak the settings here and there, but these days, I pretty much just leave the settings at their default recommendations unless something just sounds off, in which case I'll try training in a different section of audio. But still, no comments from the clients. No one is saying, this episode sounded different, or this episode sounds bad. What did you change? And if we combine this with the comments that I've seen on videos testing out like AI voice cloning, even on one of my own videos where just many people couldn't hear much of a difference, it tells me that as editors, we generally worry too much about things that others don't hear or care about. And this is takeaway or lesson number 3. Listeners are still going to listen as long as the content is good and the audio quality is good enough. If we, as editors, are hitting 80 to 90% on our arbitrary audio scale, we're going to be fine. No one is going to stop listening because of the audio quality. We really need to stop obsessing on fixing every little thing, every imperfection. I saw a poll on a Facebook group a couple weeks ago asking, you realize a guest has mispronounced a word and you're unable to get a retake. Nearly 25% of the 148 editors who participated said they would spend some amount of time trying to replace this mispronounced word with copied syllables from elsewhere in the episode. This is just insane to me. Literally, no one cares. No one cares about this. The audience understands no one's perfect, and we all mispronounce words now and then. But no one is going to stop listening because somebody mispronounced a word. One person mentioned that they won't spend more than 15 minutes trying to Frankenstein the correct pronunciation. And I'm thinking, 15 minutes is eating into our profitability for something that has no real impact on the listening experience. That word is gone in what, half a second? The most I'm willing to spend is 60 seconds on any edit. If it can't be fixed in 60 seconds, it's not worth putting more time into. And one of my biggest pieces of advice for editors is to check your ego at the door. As editors, we are service providers. Our job is not to care more about the quality than the client does. If we were recording this engineering, yeah, then we would be more invested in the overall quality. But when the client is recording stuff and they give us garbage, that's on them. That's not on us to fix. And really, these are not our shows that we're working on. These are our clients' shows. As a creative service provider, we have to accept that the outputs we create are limited by the client. Not every client is going to provide us with portfolio-worthy work. A good example of this is when we build websites for clients. We rarely end up with a live portfolio piece because the client almost inevitably has some specific vision that just doesn't look good, or they wanted a poor UI UX, but that's what they're paying for. We can try to argue with them about why that's not going to look good or why it's not going to work, but at the end of the day, they're paying for what they want. And that's our job as creative service providers. Another example that comes to mind is it's a situation Tara found herself in when working for a company. She'd created a video for them that would be displayed at their conference booth. The decision makers spent hours and hours of company resources watching this video, asking for revisions, and this is a 5-second animation. Something at the door of their booth. It's something that no one at the event is really paying any attention to, but they obsessed over it like if it wasn't perfect, that it would somehow cause people not to visit their booth. And the bottom line is that our work doesn't have to be perfect. If the client doesn't give us great audio, it doesn't matter what we do, the output is never going to sound great. So if we strive for perfection, we are wasting our own time and our own resources over little things that really don't matter to anyone. The reality is that very few, if any, of our clients are paying us enough to aim for that level of perfection. They're paying us for good enough. And the truth is that good enough is all that matters as long as the client is happy with those results. If we over-deliver on every episode, we're just going to burn ourselves out and reduce how much we earn for each hour of work we do. And like I said, to this day, I haven't had a client come back to me after receiving an episode asking for anything beyond content edits or maybe replacing a section of dialogue where they wanted to rephrase something. No requests to cut out this quiet noise here, no requests to make this change to the mix, no requests to Frankenstein words together. They just don't care about these things. Another example that podcasters and audiences aren't looking for perfection is the growing number of podcasters who are handling their own editing using text-based editors like Descript and Riverside. These tools, they're getting better each month, and it's not just the no-budget, low-budget clients or podcasters who are using these tools now. Many editors and many corporations are turning to these tools because they allow them to produce their own content in-house. the reality is not all creative teams have someone with an audio background on staff. And AI really is kind of a weird beast in that it starts at the bottom of an industry, and then as it gets adopted, we start seeing corporations look into it and start adopting it. So now we have the bottom of the industry being squeezed out by AI. Now the top of the industry is starting to use it and cutting out their reliance on outsourcing. So we start seeing a compression of the industry. And that's what I started seeing in 2024. The big budget clients, they're less willing to spend as much because the technology is making it easier for themselves to produce podcasts in-house. The big budget clients, they're more willing to investigate bringing these things in-house where they can manage their costs more than if they're outsourcing their editing. Low budget clients, they're doing the same thing. Why pay $50, $100, $150 an episode when you can pay $20, $25 for a subscription to Descript? Or maybe they're already using Riverside and are using the Riverside editor. Either way, AI has lowered the bar for entry. We have far more editors than ever before, and unfortunately, more and more podcasters are turning to marketplaces like Fiverr and Upwork to find editors or managers. As a case in point, as I was planning out this video, I was notified that the agency I subcontract for was cutting ties with me and other editors and engineers due to slowing sales and increasing market competition. This was an agency that worked on big budget branded shows, but there weren't many new shows being brought in. So when you're only bringing in 2, 3, 4 new shows in a year, this wasn't a big surprise to me. And this is number 4. The market, it's changing. These 3 factors, more podcasters taking on their own editing, more competition, and global marketplaces, they're all working together to push prices down. Despite what the Podcast Editors Group survey tells us, the typical podcast editor is not charging $200 per episode. The typical podcaster isn't paying $200 per episode. Many editors who charge a premium, they got into editing before podcasting exploded in popularity. They established themselves before AI and Fiverr and Upwork started to really dilute the talent pool. They established themselves when the market was small. And there's this idea that happy clients will continue to pay more as we have to raise our rates as our overhead increases. And yeah, this is true up to a point. But there will come a point where it just becomes too much for the client. So what happens when we cross that line with the client? They decide to look into their options and they realize they can find a comparable editor for a fraction of what they're paying. And really, let's be honest, podcast editing, it's not that difficult. There's really nothing special about what we do. And many clients are just paying us just to save them the time of editing themselves. And probably we can get better results than they would be able to achieve doing it themselves. It's not surprising that we're seeing a big increase in video podcasts this year. People seem to associate this with YouTube jumping into the podcasting game. I don't think that's the real reason here. I feel the real reason goes back to AI and those text-based editors. These technologies, they made it easier and cheaper for people to transition to video podcasts. Audio podcasts aren't dead, but we're starting to see video surpass audio. And this brings us to number 5. Video is becoming the preferred format for podcasts. YouTube has better features for interacting with your audience, And there's no denying that YouTube's algorithm makes it much easier for content to be discovered if you know what you're doing. It's not as easy as just putting up videos and being found. And we need to realize that not all podcasts are going to thrive on YouTube as full length, talking head type content. But there are good reasons for every podcast to leverage video as part of their marketing strategy. By leveraging the power of video, most shows can increase their reach and their audience base. It's more about finding what works for you and your show. We know that podcasting has embraced video when most of the diehards, the ones who have been yelling at the clouds about how podcasts can only be audio, they've now started editing or producing video podcasts themselves. There's a few that will make that concession, but only if the video is distributed via an RSS feed. It's like, let's just move on past these rigid definitions of what a podcast is or isn't. Once the public has started calling YouTube videos of people talking a podcast, we have to accept that the definition of what a podcast is has changed. Can anybody tell me why an interview that is released as audio over an RSS feed is a podcast, but the very same interview posted to YouTube is not? Podcasting is about the spirit of the content, not the delivery mechanism. Just like podcasting existed before RSS feeds and iPods, if we really think about it, podcasting can be looked at as a rebranding or audio blogs 2.0, just with an improved delivery method. Podcasting will continue to evolve over time, and we shouldn't fight these changes. We should embrace the growth and accept that it can still be audio only if we want it to be. No one is forcing anybody to make a video podcast, yet I do see some people who want that discoverability of YouTube without actually using video. They just want to use their cover art and the audio track, and that is going to be a tough proposition. YouTube will always push what people want, and the stats show that they prefer real video on YouTube. If they want audio, they'll be listening in their preferred podcast player. Hopefully, there was something in this video that will help you grow as a podcast editor, but things are quickly changing, and I feel that the days of making a living solely from editing audio have passed us by. Many clients, they're looking for generalists, people who can help them with many tasks, but not just one specific one. This is why podcast managers have been doing really well compared to editors. They were ahead of the curve and are now reaping the rewards as editors kind of play catch up and figure out how to provide more services that clients are looking for. As for me, 2025 is the year when we start to really move away from client production work as our primary offering. So what about you? What did you learn this year? What changes are you planning for 2025? What concerns do you have heading into 2025? Let me know in the comments below. As usual, thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.